Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CineHistorians podcast. This is episode 7 of our second season. Episode 7 of our season about the Sight and Sound Top 100 list from 2022, the greatest films of all time, as that magazine outlined in their critics poll. And on this one, Raquel, we're looking at a very interesting film indeed. So I should say, of course, I'm Carl Sweeney, joined by my co-host Raquel Stecher, as ever. Yeah, Raquel, are you excited about this episode?
I could say that I'm lit up for the episode.
Hey. And that's very appropriate because we're looking at a film from just a few years ago, one of the more recent films on that Sight and Sound list. It's 2019's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And I'm glad we're doing this one, not just because of the film itself, but it's been nice, I think, to do a real mix of films on this series, you know, from some older movies that have got a real history on this list to a film like this or a film like In the Mood for Love, where they're much more contemporary. So it's going to be really, really interesting. Raquel, do you want to take it away with some relevant background here?
Yes. So I wanted to talk about the director, Céline Sciamma. She's a French filmmaker and she's best known for her directorial work, but she's also a prolific screenwriter and she's contributed screenplays to other directors' projects. Sciamma's background, so she holds a master's degree in French literature and she studied film at La Famille in Paris. And she grew up reading books and watching movies, and she credits her grandmother actually with her interest in film. She started her filmmaking career by contributing scripts to short films, and then her feature film debut as a director was Water Lilies from 2007. And that film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival as part of their On Certain Regard section. And it was a big hit with multiple nominations and award wins. Water Lilies starred Adèle Haenel, who would go on to work with Sciamma on a short film, Pauline, from 2009, and then Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which we're talking about today. Other films Sciamma directed include Tomboy from 2011, Girlhood from 2014, both critically acclaimed. And those two films, along with Water Lilies, form a loose trilogy of coming-of-age films, which she became known for. Those coming of age films really put her on the map as a filmmaker. In interviews, she's talked about how coming of age films were pure cinema. She was drawn to those stories because they could work in various styles, time periods, places, and they had a very direct approach in how they would explore identity and self-discovery. One thing interesting about Sciamma, she calls filmmaking a reconstitution of reality. And so she's very intentional in her casting choices, in the choreography of her scenes, as well as making sure her characters and her stories convey a sense of authenticity. And there's this awareness of the audience's perception of the story, and a lot of her decisions based on making sure the film is perceived by the viewer in the way it was intended to be conveyed. Sciamma's films focus a lot on female characters and explore how they grapple with like their existence, their perceived identity, and their social sphere, and the disconnect that might have with like their true selves. And her films are all about connection, both connection to other people, but also a connection to oneself. So over the years, Céline Sciamma has been like an outspoken proponent for women filmmakers. She feels very strongly about the inequality in the business, from lack of access to funding to greenlight projects, poor representation at festivals, sexual harassment, exploitation, lots of things. In 2019 at the Cannes Film Festival, she premiered what's considered to be her best work, and that's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And the following year, she made another acclaimed film, Petite Maman, which was released in 2021. And that was her most recent feature film. After she directed a short film called This Is How a Child Becomes a Poet. More recently, she's contributed to two scripts for two Noémie Merlant films. And Noémie Merlant is in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And that is Jacques Audiard's Paris 13th District, released in 2021. And then The Balconettes, released last year, which not only stars Noémie Merlant, but is also written and directed by her. It's a film I definitely want to catch soon. And we can only hope that there are more Céline Sciamma films in the pipeline.
Yeah, hopefully. I think all the films you mentioned are really well worth people checking out if they haven't seen them. I think, like you say about the intentionality, it's very clear when you read what she says in interviews, that she's a very thoughtful filmmaker. And I'm sure we'll have a look at some of the things she said about this movie as we go along through the episode. I think there's a good case that she's certainly one of the strongest filmmakers active in the world at the moment. I think she's fantastic.
I agree.
Okay, so I'll do a bit of an introduction to Portrait of a Lady on Fire. As ever, the kind of customary spoiler alert, you watch it before you hear us talk about it. So now's a good time to go and do that and then come back to us. Worth saying at the outset that this is a period film. It's set in the 18th century. It begins with a classroom setting where we meet a woman called Marianne, played by the actress Raquel mentioned, Noémie Merlant. She's the teacher of the class. She's being drawn by the pupils, the students. And the students discover a portrait of a woman called Heloise, whose clothes are on fire in the portrait. And we then jump back in time. The main bulk of the film is set on a remote island off the coast of France. So Marianne is coming to the island. She has been hired under the guise, really, of being a companion for Heloise, who's played by Adèle Haenel. However, the real reason is that Marianne is there to paint Heloise without her knowing about it, because the perception is that she would almost certainly refuse to pose for the painting. The situation is that Heloise's family want her to marry a wealthy man. She's resisting. The painting is going to be the wedding portrait. So as the film continues, we watch this developing relationship between the two women, and that's an artistic relationship. You know, ultimately, Heloise does consent to being painted by Marianne, and also a personal relationship. Both women, we soon realize, are attracted to one another. I think at this point, just to say that the film is concerned with the way this relationship between the two women changes as the film progresses. Is there anything else about the film's background that you wanted to talk about here, Raquel?
Yeah, the background of this film is actually really interesting. The film was written by the director Céline Sciamma, and she had become really interested in women painters of the 18th century. And like you said, this is where the film is set. And in her research, she discovered that there were many successful women painters at the time. Many of them focused on portraits for like aristocrats and royalty, mostly women. For example, Marie Antoinette's official portrait artist was Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun. Sciamma wanted to make a film about one of those women painters, but she didn't want it to be a biopic. So she used like real history, and she worked with a historian who specialized in the era to help her develop the character of Marianne in the film. So it was really based on a lot of research. In her writing the script, she was also intentional about it not being about an artist and a muse, because a muse suggests a form of like objectification and fetishization, but she wanted the characters to be equal in their relationship and with each other, even if they weren't equal in society. And that makes the making of the portrait a collaboration instead of artist and muse. And that also extended to the production of the film, because Sciamma made the collaborative experience on the set with everyone involved. And the actresses have talked about how they felt like they were part of the process. And so for the two principals, Sciamma cast Adèle Haenel as Heloise, and as I had said, she had worked with her before. They were also romantic partners, and at one time, but they had amicably split before the production of the film, but they were still very comfortable with each other. So for Marianne, Sciamma wanted somebody relatively unknown. She wanted the lesbian love story to be believable, and there would be some disconnect if she chose somebody who was famous and identifiable. She didn't want a public figure performing queerness, essentially. Rather, she wanted it to be like a blank slate and make the character come off as more authentic. Like she's almost like building a portrait of this actress too. So the production of the film took 38 days, was filmed in Brittany and Seine-et-Marne in France. And Sciamma shot in digital format in very high resolution in order to pick up a lot of the visual details of the paintings, the landscape, the actresses' faces, the costumes. But because it was such a high resolution, it meant that the actresses could easily come out of focus. So they had to be very deliberate with movement. And you can tell that, especially with the close-up shots. Portrait of a Lady on Fire, set the scene on fire. Like it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in competition for the Palme d'Or. It didn't win the Palme d'Or, but it did win the Queer Palme for Best LGBTQ Film, as well as the award for Best Screenplay. The title in French is Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, which translates to Portrait of a Young Girl on Fire. Some say that translating it to Portrait of a Lady on Fire would hint at the novel by Henry James, The Portrait of a Lady, which was adapted to screen by Jane Campion. It's actually one of my favorite films. And Jane Campion also directed the piano. And Sciamma in interviews has said that the ending of the piano inspired the beginning of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I think is really interesting. And the movie has gone on to become a favorite among critics and viewers. It's had a notable cultural impact, and it's been considered not only one of the best lesbian films ever made, but one of the best films ever made, hence its appearance on the Sight and Sound list. So just to kind of segue into that, a little history about the Sight and Sound list. Of course, its only first appearance could be on the 2022 list, and it arrived at the 30th spot. It's actually one of a few films released after 2012 that was added to the 2022 list. Others include Moonlight from 2016, which is tied for 60th place, Parasite from 2019, which is tied for the 90th spot, and Get Out from 2017, which is tied for the 95th spot. And to just break that down further real quickly, the 100 films on that 2022 Sight and Sound list, 91 of them are from the 1900s and 9 of them are from the 2000s. And if you want to break that down by century, there are 93 films from the 20th century and 7 films from the 21st century. So in addition to those films that I had mentioned, films from the 2000s include In the Mood for Love from 2000, which we talked about a few episodes ago, The Gleaners and I, Mulholland Drive, Spirited Away, and Tropical Malady. And who knows, like next time we see a new critics poll, there might be even more films from the 2000s and maybe fewer from the 1900s.
That would make a lot of sense. And I suppose the question will be, of the films like this one or Moonlight or Parasite, the ones that came in on the most recent list, you never quite know if they'll go all, will it be a film like In the Mood for Love, which has now appeared on multiple lists? I suspect this one will be because it's placed so highly, right? It's number 30.
Yeah.
But I think you sort of do need to wait and see on that. But I mean, it's a fantastic film, so it's got a very strong chance, I think, of being right in there in the 2032 list as well. Why did you choose it then, Raquel? Just as we sort of move more into the general discussion about the film, it could have been another one of those more recent films that you chose to focus on. What was it about this one that stood out to you and that you thought would be a good, would make this a good topic for discussion?
This is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's in my letterbox 4. It's actually number 1. It's kind of hovering there with Bachelor Mother from 1939, which has always been my favorite film. But this one is, I think, tied with my favorite film. It just, when I first watched it, it kind of blew me out of the water. It was amazing. And words can't really express how much I love and appreciate this film. I'm just grateful that this film came to be in my lifetime and that I got to experience it for a first time and for many times after that. And so it was a very natural choice for me to pick this one, but also because there's so much to talk about this movie because it's so rich in themes and meaning and motifs, and visually it's stunning. We could talk about it for hours.
Yeah, and we may well do so. I mean, I'm very glad that you did choose it because I think it's superb as well. And I think you're right. And actually, going back to what we said earlier, that because Céline Sciamma is such a thoughtful filmmaker, and that's really evident in the film itself, it is a film that really lends itself to dissecting, and to analysis. And I know one of the things you really wanted to talk about is this idea that Sciamma herself has referred to. She's referred to Portrait of a Lady on Fire as, quote, a manifesto about the female gaze. So I'll just kind of tee you up for that by saying that Of course, this is a film where men barely feature. We do see very few men in the film. We see
Yeah.
men rowing that boat at the start. I think there's a man who is nailing the crate shirt later on towards the end,
The men at
which
the
isn't,
gallery at the very end too. Yeah.
yeah, but very few and far between.
Yeah.
Although that doesn't mean that there aren't signs of the fact that this is a world where male authority is kind of paramount.
Right.
Like I already said, Eloise is expected to marry this wealthy man. But we have this quite independent woman in Marianne who even she is kind of subject to male control, because we discover that she's had to submit her artwork under her father's name to get it exhibited and things like this. What I think is really interesting is that Sciamma, when she's talked about this, she's talked about wanting to make a film that's very different. She said that there are lots of films basically where there's the same old negotiation, the same old power dynamic, and that she wanted to make a love story or even a story about friendship that didn't have that old dynamic. So one of the ways that's done is by taking the man out of the frame.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that's really striking about the film, isn't it? Yeah. What do you make about what she was saying? That a manifesto about the female gaze. It's interesting.
This movie is just all about the female gaze, and it's one of the reasons it's had such a huge impact on people, because it shows us like the possibilities and realities. Like in this case, it shows us the female gaze, and it comes to us in stark contrast to the male gaze, which, if you think about it, has dominated movies for a very long time. Eloise is like the subject of a painting, but she's not a muse or an object of desire, like I mentioned earlier. The gaze in this movie is one of like emotion and understanding and learning. It's how women look at each other, because there are no men in the movie except, like you said, at the beginning and at the end. So really we're just here with the female gaze. The female gaze too also builds this portrait of a love story. There's the nuances of the gaze, the smile, the look away. There's something that was just because of something that was just said or felt. There's the flirtations, the depth of feeling and caring. That all kind of goes with the not just female gaze, female connection to each other. And what I think is interesting too is how, because it is devoid of men and you only have them kind of bookmarked in the movie, most of the movie takes place in the chateau. And in that chateau, there is a sense of equality. You got the three women, you have Sophie the maid, Marianne the painter, and Eloise the aristocrat. And despite Sophie and Marianne working for the family, Eloise is seen as an equal among them, which I think is really interesting. There's the scene in the kitchen where we see Sophie preparing food. Eloise is cutting up some meat that was on the spit, and I think Marianne is preparing the wine. And there is no sense in that scene and in many others that Sophie and Marianne are in servitude to Eloise, rather that they are all kind of working together. This especially becomes apparent in the sequence with Sophie's abortion. Both Marianne and Eloise are helping her. They both attend the eventual abortion. And even in the scene where Marianne is making a small painting of what had just happened, Eloise is posing as the local woman who performed the abortion. Then Sophie is laying down, almost like Eloise could have also have done this. This is they're equal among each other. It's like you said, there was that hint of like there's the men, like we know that there's a aristocrat in Milan who is interested in Eloise, and the painting is really for him. The Countess is the mother of Eloise, who we only see a few times during the film. She just comes quickly and then leaves. She sort of represents what's going on in that outside world, that patriarchy outside, kind of embodies like the representation of the duty of women in this society and the inevitable failure of any sort of defiance, because there are certain rules. And even the Countess in conversation, she understands why both of her daughters didn't want this life. We learn that her first daughter committed suicide just before marriage because she didn't want that. And Eloise is pushing against that too. And there's this understanding, but then sort of the Countess represents like that expectation that's still out there. They have this reprieve in this sort of equal space of the chateau. It's quite interesting how Sciamma was able to sort of build that world within a world.
Yeah, and I think Sciamma definitely wanted to build this world by sidestepping cliches in a number of ways. Again, back to the point about her being a very intentional thoughtful filmmaker. So she's talked about how films involving lesbian love are often about the impossibility of that relationship. It's always about the obstacles, and that there's something very conventional about that. Something very conventional about the way that sex is often foregrounded in such films. And therefore, although it's a very popular, acclaimed film, when people were coming to her sometimes who didn't like it and were saying things like there's not enough sex, or there's not enough focus on how much of a taboo it is to be a lesbian, especially at that period of time, she was very glad, actually, because she was very much trying to avoid falling into those conventions. She's very interesting, I think, when she talks about this idea of the gaze, because she has said in interviews that, look, a woman doesn't by default have a female gaze. A man doesn't necessarily have just a male gaze because he's a man. It becomes about how filmmakers are able to deconstruct the way they look at things, and that some filmmakers are really in tune with the way our culture produces imagery. And not everybody is interested in that. Not everybody has that level of awareness. And I think she's right that it's a very complex idea. Because I think when you look online, I think sometimes people who are studying film for the first time, sometimes they will look at a film where there's a beautiful woman. And if that film is directed by a man, I think that in and of itself is taken to be the male gaze in action. But the idea, as Laura Mulvey laid it out in that essay I talked about on the Vertigo episode, is I didn't get into all the psychoanalytical aspects of it, but she was talking about this idea of the unconscious of society being patriarchal. So I think if you sort of take that idea, then I think what Sciamma is saying is right, that if you have women filmmakers who are really steeped in that patriarchal culture, they maybe just could replicate the way that culture has a dominant gaze. So she's right, I think, that there's a level of deconstruction involved, and that if people are really critically interrogating the images they encounter and the images they produce, you can come at things in a different way. And I think that's actually explored in the narrative of this film, actually, in the sense that Marianne produces a very conventional painting to begin with, and then is kind of like pulled up in that in a way. And she finds a more unique way of looking at her subject later on. So I think that's kind of an echo of what the filmmaker herself is trying to do with the film as a whole. But just as a quick example of what we're talking about, Sciamma and the cinematographer of this film, one of the filmmakers they were inspired by was Ingmar Bergman, and they rewatched some of his films to study the way he filmed women, because sometimes there's a real intimacy to the way Bergman does that in films like Persona. So I think she's very aware of the complexities, is all I'm trying to say. Does that kind of make sense?
That makes sense, because it's that internal misogyny that will come through regardless of gender, but it's an informed thing. It's like, what society do you live in? What is it feeding you? How women should be looked at, and that kind of conveys regardless of the gender of the director. But I like that she's really fighting against all of that in this, with so many really key decisions of how things are being portrayed. And like you said, I think that's a really great point about that first portrait being more conventional, and then you build this other portrait that's got more meaning. And I'll talk about a little more about that later. But in that way, the film is sort of meta, because you sort of see the director's process in making a film through the film.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting distinction maybe between what she avoids, I think, is a really voyeuristic approach. That doesn't mean there isn't a high level of visual pleasure involved in watching the film, because I think that there is, but what it doesn't do are the things that a more voyeuristic director might do. So, and I think it's very conscious of the fact that it's playing with expectations there. There's a scene, isn't there, where there's kind of a close-up of two fingers that are, for want of a better word, penetrating Heloise. And it's not exactly clear initially what's going on, but we take a moment and we realize that it's her armpit that we're seeing, isn't it? And then also the scene where we see her topless in bed, and we also, in that scene, to bring the armpit back into it, we see her armpit hair, which in Western society is often kind of almost frowned upon for women. And you can think about that inclusion as a conscious way to avoid it being a stereotypically objectifying approach here. And Sciamma's talked about how it's like, they're naked, but they're not exposed. The way their breasts are flat against their chest, it's kind of natural. So that's all part of the gaze of this film for me, is that it's not doing some of these things we might expect to see in a different film. It's not having these fetishistic close-ups. It's not having
Yeah.
these like really voyeuristic zooms into different body parts. It goes back to your point again, doesn't it? How intentional everything is. That these are choices that have been made for a reason, you know?
Yeah, and the fact that they don't really wear makeup, they're dressed very not it's not necessarily all super period accurate, but it is in many senses because they're restricted to what they have. They don't have photography, they have these paintings, they have the memory of those gazes. Going back to your point, there's also Marianne gazing on Eloise, but then Eloise looking back and interrupting her gaze, and this acknowledgement that she's being stared at. And I think that's really interesting. That happens throughout the film, and it's quite arresting, and it's giving you some sort of awareness. She's not this object to look at, but in the beginning, she sort of is. It's this kind of lie of, oh, I'm pretending to be your companion, but I'm really just taking in your image to paint it.
It is, because I think that would be like a really old convention from photography, for example, that when eminent men were photographed, they very often like address the camera head on, and there was more of a kind of cliche of like a side on profile of a woman. So the idea that a woman is looked at but doesn't look, and that's kind of overturned in this film, like you say. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating. It's fascinating, it really is. What Céline Sciamma said was that not every critic everywhere really engaged with how it was trying to approach gender. So she actually singled out US film critics and UK film critics for praise, that she was having a totally different conversation around the film in those countries, because she felt there was more of a politicized awareness, a more quote unquote gender studies approach. She called it a gender studies approach, isn't despised necessarily by critics from those countries. And she was negatively contrasting that with French critics, that in France there was a more conventional approach, apparently. At least that was her experience of the reception of this film.
Even
So
with a
that's interesting to
filmmaker
know.
like Catherine Breillat, who is a French provocateur, even in her films, there's the body of a woman is very much objectified. There's lots of shots of a woman, and she's even famous for really close-up shots of the crotch area, having that be just like very shocking. Even with other French women filmmakers, sometimes you'll still get that the female gaze, but it's really also informed by sort of this male gaze too. I don't know, what she's doing is really interesting, and I could totally see how a US and even a Canadian audience would have interpreted this very differently than maybe a French audience.
Like you were sort of alluding to earlier, I think there's a very interesting cultural dimension to this particular story, that Sciamma had found like all these female painters from this period that's been represented in the film who'd kind of been overlooked or forgotten. You mentioned, I think, some of the women there earlier, and the character Marianne is kind of inspired by a couple of them. It's a fascinating way to kind of acknowledge overlooked women, isn't it? And
Yeah.
Sciamma sort of said she had a real urge to do so, that, she discovered about all these women, they'd been forgotten, and it really informed the film that was being made. And I really like that impulse. I think it speaks really well of her. Okay, Raquel, so we got lots to discuss on this episode to come, of course. In this section, is there anything else you wanted to throw in before we move on to things like key moments?
No, we got to make some time because we have a lot more to say on the other side.
Okay, in which case we'll take a very quick break, and then we'll be back to discuss some key moments, to discuss some wider issues, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So look forward to seeing you all again soon. All right, welcome back everybody to CineHistorians. We are still having a great time discussing Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And just as a quick reminder again, we're discussing this film because it was very highly placed on the most recent Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time in 2022. And we have arrived at the section of the podcast we call Key Moments, where we each pick a couple of things to discuss in more detail. Raquel, do you want to go first?
I'm going to briefly talk about this key moment because I want to save some time for my other key moment, which I really want to dive into. So I just really wanted to talk about the first portrait reveal, which we had already talked about a little bit already, and also the posing sessions. So this is just after Marianne has revealed to Eloise that she's been painting her portrait in secret, and Eloise looks at the painting and asks, "Is that me? Is that how you see me?" And she's kind of offended. And this first version of the portrait is lacking depth, and like you had said, it's a little more commercial. And Eloise is talking about how there's no emotion, no life. Eloise is very expressive. There's a mention of how her anger always stays at the surface, but there's also just this intensity to her expression too. And even when we see her smile emerge throughout the film, there's also an intensity with that too. Marianne doesn't capture this. Eloise thinks it's just surface level. And what makes the discussion interesting to me is about like the informed gaze, like how we gaze upon something, we interpret what we see with the information we do have, and then also the information we lack. And we also filter that through emotion. So Marianne has revealed herself to be a painter, and Eloise has revealed herself to be a more complex person of depth and feeling. So these two must learn more about each other. So that sort of springboards that journey. And the film continues with those gazes and those conversations that teach them more and more about each other and help them appreciate their true selves. So after the painting, Marianne kind of wipes away the face of the portrait and is confronted by the Countess, who was prepared to take the painting. And Marianne, she says she needs more time. Eloise steps in and says, I'll pose for it. In this instance, and I'll talk about this a little more later, but it buys them more time together and more time to learn about each other. And we see how that progresses with the subsequent posings. So the first posing is very matter of fact. Marianne is like guiding Eloise on how to sit, hold her hand, how to direct her gaze, how to hold her head. But in the second posing, there's a little bit more intimacy. Marianne and Eloise are telling each other about each other's mannerisms, what they've observed, like what they do physically when they are feeling a certain emotion. So we learned that they are learning a lot more about each other. In the third posing, they've already become intimate. Eloise can't help but smile. She's trying to like suppress the smile because she has so much joy. And then in the fourth posing is when they know it's their last day together. And there's this somberness that the completion of the portrait is the completion of their intimate time together. So I really like how those posing sessions throughout the film kind of just demonstrate the different stages of their relationship together.
That's a really good observation. Yeah. I'm also going to keep this key moment a little bit shorter, and I'm going to try and tee up Raquel for her next key moment as I do so. I really wanted to highlight the fairly brief moments in the film, but I think very striking ones where we see those ghostly visions of Eloise. And this is when Marianne is walking through the house at night and she sees Eloise in a white wedding dress. And the ghost, quote unquote, doesn't speak, is lit in quite a theatrical way, in a way that differs with the style of the rest of the film, where we get a more naturalistic approach. And I think that's a large part of why those images stand out so much. I actually find them quite chilling whenever they occur.
Yeah.
What I want to ponder a little bit is like, what do they actually represent? So perhaps we can say, and I want to get Raquel's thoughts on this too, but perhaps we can say, rather than this being any kind of an actual ghost, we can take them as a representation of Marianne's fear of the eventual separation from Eloise. So she presumably finds this idea of Eloise in the wedding dress quite unsettling, because that of course means they won't be together. There's no prospect, of course, at this point in history of them being able to marry each other or any other woman. So that's the way I take them, is as visions coming from Marianne's mind. I think you can say there's a level of ambiguity there, because Marianne and the ghostly vision, they do appear in the same shot. So it isn't as if we're seeing something that's categorically from Marianne's point of view. It's not a classic point of view shot all the time, if you see what I mean. But I take them as a kind of foreshadowing as well, because later in the film, and I think you'll touch on this more in a moment, Raquel, but there is a chase, of course, involves Eloise in the wedding dress. Marianne has to turn and face the woman she loves wearing that dress. So I think I take the visions as kind of symbolic of the fact and of the fear from Marianne that ultimately these two women will have to part ways. How do you interpret them? Because I think, like I say, there's some scope there to read them in different ways. How do you take them?
I like that they add a fantasy element to the film. And if you're watching for the first time, you don't really know exactly what it represents. So it is just sort of a fantasy element there. But once you know what happens, where we see Eloise in the white dress at the top of the stairs, Marianne gets one last look and then it's like lights out. just kind of like where the ghostly visions appear. She appears at the stairs in the white dress, and it's just lights out too, because the image just sort of just suddenly disappears. So for me, it's that foreboding that they know that she knows that the time is ending, that also in her creation of the painting is bringing about the end too. So I don't know, it's a really nice, there's so many really great motifs and elements and themes in this movie.
Like that's a good point about the completion. Like if she actually finishes what she was brought to this island to do, that is the end. And that's a really good point. Okay, so why don't you give us your next key moment, which, like I said, hopefully that's tees you up for it fairly nicely.
It does, because this is about another recurring motif in the film, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And that's a Greek myth that appears in Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And for anyone unfamiliar with the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, it's about a deadly gaze. In the story, Orpheus sings and plays the lyre to the gods, asking to bring his wife Eurydice back from the dead. She's already traveled down the river Styx to the underworld. They're moved by his music, and he's allowed to retrieve her from the underworld and bring her back to the world of the living, but on one condition: he cannot look back at her. So when they're making that ascension back up to the world of the living, he thinks that she has lost her way, and he looks back at her, at Eurydice, and that one fatal glance causes Eurydice's second death. So I love how this myth ties in to the movie. If you compare with the story of Marianne and Eloise, Marianne is given two chances with Eloise. She's tasked with painting her portrait without Eloise's knowledge, and when she's done with that portrait, she knows giving it to the Countess means that Eloise will be taken away from her. So as we discussed, like Eloise's painting faces is wiped off. Marianne starts again, giving her more time with Eloise. But there's this knowledge that even though she has more time with Eloise, she'll be taken away again, like Eurydice at that second death. Orpheus is given more time with her, but that glance takes her away. I think that's just a really interesting correlation. The myth is actually really important throughout especially the second half of the movie, and especially the ending. So Eloise is reading from Book 10 of Ovid's The Metamorphoses, and they're reading the story of Orpheus and Eurydice in the kitchen, and it's Eloise reading from it to Marianne and Sophie, and they have this really interesting discussion about Orpheus's decision to look back. Sophie says he had no choice. Marianne said that he chooses the memory of her, and that glance was one of a poet, not a lover. Eloise says maybe it was Eurydice that asked him to turn around, which kind of speaks to that moment when she appears in the wedding dress, and it's the last time they really see each other together, and Eloise tells Marianne, look, or turn around, like, look at me. So then the most important way this shows up, I think, is in connection to the book and to a painting. So the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, when Eloise and Marianne are in bed for that one final time, Marianne is drawing a little portrait of Eloise, which looks like the larger portrait that she had painted. And Marianne says it's so that she can remember Eloise. And Eloise makes a really great point that with the passage of time, the rendering of her on that little mini portrait will replace her real image in Marianne's mind. Just another layer of like how gaze and memory kind of play into this. Eloise is like, well, I'm not going to have any image of you. And Marianne says, I'll draw my self-portrait in a book. And Eloise tells her she wants her drawn just as she is on page 28 of the book. And that's the end of the Orpheus and Eurydice story as it appears in that book. So that's really all meaningful. Page 28 to me is the most meaningful motif in the story. It's like the gut punch we get at the end. It's a lot of people remember this, especially after Eloise and Marianne part. We go back to the present day, which is several years after. There's the art gallery scene. Marianne is attending it, and her painting is up. And like you had said before, she has to paint under her father's name. And this portrait is listed as her father's, but is actually hers. And it's of Orpheus and Eurydice. In the painting, one of the male patrons is trying, almost kind of mansplaining to her, oh, like, this is your dad's painting. And she's like, nope, it's mine. But he makes a point that in other depictions of Orpheus and Eurydice already dead, Orpheus hasn't looked back yet. It's imminent. But in this case, it's Orpheus looking back. Eurydice's still alive, but she's starting to fall backwards. So it's the last glance that they have for each other. And she captures that exact moment on her painting. And then page 28 comes out again because Marianne sees in the pamphlet for the gallery a portrait of Eloise is there, and she runs to it. We see Eloise, and this is just like one of the best moments of the movie. We see the portrait of Eloise. She's older, she has a child, and she's holding a book in her lap, and her finger has turned the pages open, and it says page 28, or it just says 28. What's interesting too is that this is so intentional because this is Eloise's message. This is her transmitting another image of her for Marianne to gaze at, and it's such an understanding, and it's only Marianne can understand what that means, and it's just so beautiful. Ending, just to touch upon the ending a little bit, the ending is just I believe about 3 minutes of Eloise at the balcony of the opera, just going through the emotions. We're just focused on her face, and she's crying, she's smiling, she's laughing a little bit. And I don't know about you, but that reminds me of the ending of Jean Dielman. That's 4 minutes of just Jean Dielman at the table going through her emotions of what just happened. I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet or has to listen to that episode, but I kind of want to think that that is a reference, because I know Céline Sciamma really loves Chantal Akerman's work, is a big advocate for her legacy. So I like to think that that's sort of a reference.
It could well be. The film I was thinking of was the film Birth with Nicole Kidman, because I think there's also a scene with a long, unbroken shot of her, and I think it's at a concert type setting as well.
You're right.
And don't know if that's an intentional influence, but that's the thing that came to mind. I think you're absolutely right to describe the power of the page 28 moment. I think that's it's absolutely superb the way that's done. To go back to the ending, well, what I wanted to talk about really was, and kind of like I already mentioned, that there are some things you might expect to see in a story like this that don't actually appear very much in the film. So we mentioned that there are barely any male characters in the film. We mentioned that there isn't as much of an emphasis on sex as there could have been. Another really notable omission is music, which is heard actually very infrequently. However, music does factor into several very important scenes in the film. Firstly, worth pointing out that the two main characters kind of bond over music. So Marianne is asked to describe what an orchestra sounds like, and she can't necessarily do that, but on a harpsichord, she plays this piece by Vivaldi known as Summer. And I think in that scene, the way I took it, Raquel, is as they're sat alongside one another, that's where you really start to sense this developing closeness, I think. It's kind of a key moment on that emerging relationship, I feel. There's another key use of music in the scene outside where the main characters are with these other women, and the women are chanting in Latin. And this is an original song that they're chanting. It's called La Jeune Fille un Feu. The Latin words apparently translate as "they can't flee." And it's fascinating to ponder what that actually might mean, because maybe there are several ways to look at that. The characters themselves can't escape, can't flee their feelings for one another. We've talked about the idea of women not being able to flee from male authority, which is quite important to the film. Céline Sciamma said the phrase was borrowed from the writing of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Again, another important scene in the film, because really Marianne's love for Eloise is coming to the surface now, and we get that unforgettable sight, don't we, of Eloise on fire. And Noémie Merlant recalled how much she enjoyed that scene, shooting it, and felt it was a really magical moment. At the end of the film, like Raquel's saying, a very striking musical moment. Again, the finale to Vivaldi's Summer Violin Concerto, the image of Eloise being watched by Marianne. And of course, it takes us back to that earlier scene with the harpsichord, when that attraction was stirring. A very captivating sight, I think, of Eloise, because she's kind of breathing heavily, seems to be finding it a very moving experience. We can only assume, I think, that the music represents for her that idea of lost love. And it's not just that we get that long, close shot of her, it's that we don't actually see the orchestra really at all, do we? We're really locked into her emotional state. So just to say, really, that in a film that's really light on music overall, it seems like when it does appear, it does so at key moments. So when that attraction is building, when things are about to move to another level, and then that very important final scene where Marianne is seeing Eloise for the last time. So
Yeah.
I don't know. How did you feel about the music? It really adds to what's going on screen, I think.
I love what Sciamma said about the fact that she used what would have been available to them, like the
Mm.
like playing the music at the home, the singing with the women at the bonfire, and then the orchestra. Those are available forms of music. And there's even a conversation about Eloise having lived at a convent before her sister dies, and then she is now required to be the one to marry and to continue like the bloodline. She actually enjoyed convent life because she had access to books and to art and to music. The fact that the availability of these things is very restricted, we're just so spoiled in the fact that we can see art or read books or experience music whenever we want, but here it's just so limited, and I think that adds an element of authenticity to the story because we know they have these limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, any other business? This is the section of the podcast where sometimes we take an even wider look at the movie in question. Raquel, did you want to start by talking about your personal experience with the film, which I think you've kind of alluded to earlier? Is
Yes.
we know this is a film you love very, very much. Tell us more about that.
Yes, so I watched this movie for the first time at the Canadian premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival. In fact, I still have my ticket, which I'll hold up for the YouTube audience. It was at the Winter Garden Theatre in Toronto, Friday, September 6th, 2019 at 3 p.m. It was introduced by Céline Sciamma, and then at the end there was a Q&A with Céline Sciamma, Adèle Haenel, and Noémie Merlant, and it was just such an amazing experience. I was in the balcony, just like Heloise was in the opera. It was really great watching Portrait of a Lady on Fire at that premiere with an audience. I was just so mesmerized. I remember when it got to that page 28 revelation with the painting, I was gripping my seat. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And when Céline Sciamma and the actresses came out, there was a standing ovation, and I'll include a clip on the YouTube version of this so that you could see. Through the Q&A, I was so in my emotion that I had to go watch a video after to see what they actually said because I only took so much of it in. I was just so happy to be there, and it was actually at first when I had heard about the movie, I was a little mad that it was The Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and I really loved the movie The Portrait of a Lady by Jane Campion, like I mentioned earlier, and I was worried that it was going to take away from that, but it just cemented that Céline Sciamma is just a really wonderful filmmaker, just like Jane Campion. I love both of them. So yeah, so I've been in love with the film ever since. I own the Criterion Blu-ray, which is behind me. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm actually wearing a Portrait of a Lady on Fire t-shirt that has the outline of the book with page 28 on it, and you can't see it now, but I will put an image of it for the YouTube audience so you can see the full shirt. Honestly, if I were ever to get a tattoo of a movie reference, I'd probably get page 28. I know the singer Halsey actually has a tattoo of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It's Adèle Haenel looking towards the camera in profile with that black fabric over her nose when they're on the beach. So there are tattoos out there, and that's probably my first pick of what I would get because I love this so much. What's really wonderful about this movie that it shows us possibilities of filmmaking, that there are avenues that we haven't explored. There are other possibilities, and some of the constraints we put on ourselves, and I just love how refreshing and different this movie is.
Mm-hmm. I'm very jealous, not just because you got to see the film in that context, but when you read out the date there. So you saw this film quite a few months before I was able to, which is not fair.
Yeah, it was on the festival circuit still.
Yeah, I think I've said this to you off air, Raquel, but I always quite powerfully associate this film with the pandemic because I think this was the last film I saw in a cinema before the UK went into the lockdown period, which means it was the last film I saw in the cinema for quite a while because, of course, we were, at home, businesses were shuttered for quite a long time. I think I saw it in that period where the point where we all knew about COVID, but we weren't sure exactly how serious it was going to become, and exactly, I don't think I necessarily knew a lockdown was impending at that time. But I sort of can't think back on this film without being taken back to those days in early 2020. I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I wish I could, because I'd rather not have that association, really. But so be it. I wanted to talk about a book. We do a lot of film recommendations on this podcast, but I wanted to throw in a bit of book discussion as well. And the book is called The Celluloid Closet by a man called Vito Russo. And I thought this was worth flagging up because I think if anyone is listening to us and has an interest or is developing an interest in the history of gay and lesbian representations in film, I think this book is a decent starting point. It was first published in the early 1980s. It was revised later on. Vito Russo, what he talks about in the book is how the idea of being gay or being lesbian, it's often been defined in cinema in a similar manner to the way that homosexuality has been defined within society itself. In other words, being gay was often positioned on screen and off as, quote unquote, a dirty secret. And then that has given way to different kinds of representations as societal attitudes have shifted. So there's a long history, and the book talks about this, of gay and lesbian characters in film stretching all the way back to the silent era, which people don't always realize. So it's giving you this kind of overview on how that has changed over time. Of course, that means that a lot of the representations were very limited and offensive at certain points in history. In terms of the lesbian characterizations, kind of like we said earlier, that very often in film, lesbian relationships have been presented in terms of a male vision of sex. In other words, in a more kind of exploitative or voyeuristic way. There's another tendency that the book's quite interesting on, the idea that critics writing about gay and lesbian relationships in film write about them differently to the way heterosexual relationships are perceived. The idea that straight relationships are just taken as the norm, and therefore those films, aren't actually about heterosexuality in the way many people write about them. Whereas a film about two lesbian women is always taken as being it's about being lesbian in a way that doesn't happen for heterosexuality. It's quite interesting in the way that the book breaks down how some of the stereotypes have shifted over time. In the 1960s, for example, very often gay and lesbian characters were marked out as unhappy or desperate or suicidal or villainous. The way that violence against such characters escalated and became a real keynote in the 1970s. The book is mainly about American cinema, but also touches on cinema from other countries too. I think it's very accessible. It's worth checking out. It led to a documentary of the same name in the mid-1990s. The author that I mentioned, Vito Russo, he died in 1990 himself. But one way that his legacy continues is that there's a monitoring group called GLAAD, which is GLAAD, formerly known as the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Discrimination, but now they just go by the acronym. And they developed something called the Vito Russo test. Russo was a founder member of this organization. So if you're listening to us and you've heard about the Bechdel test, which is about how women characters are represented, well, the Vito Russo test is about how LGBTQ characters are portrayed. And what it involved, kind of a set of criteria. So whether the film in question contains a character who's identifiably lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and or queer, whether that character is solely or mainly defined by their sexual orientation or their gender identity, whether they're tied to the plot in such a way that they're actually a significant character. Could you remove the character and make a big difference to the film? Or are they just there to be color or punchline, or, are they inessential?
Sidekick.
Yeah, exactly. And then they added a new criteria to the test in recent years, with the idea that the character in question, that their story must not be outwardly offensive. So if you have a film with multiple LGBTQ characters, at least one character must pass that point for the film to pass that criteria. So what they do is every year they look at mainstream films, and the most recent results we have at the time of recording are for 2024. And they said that 75% of the LGBTQ inclusive films that they looked at passed the test. And what that means is of the 250 films they looked at in total, 18% of them passed the test because not every film had a relevant character. So yeah, the way they frame it is that the test is kind of like the minimal expected standard. What they're hoping for is for a greater number of films to actually, go way past just ticking off these criteria. It's a first step to pass this test, but it's not the finish line, is how they put it. So yeah, just like I said, Raquel, I think The Celluloid Closet, it's a significant book. It's quite accessible. It's a good starting point, I think. That's all I would say.
I've seen the documentary, but I've been meaning to read the book, so that's a great recommendation.
Yeah, the documentary, like I say, is from around, I think, 1995, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Okay, from book recommendations to film recommendations, which of course has to come. And I think at least one or two of these would have been mentioned earlier in the podcast, right?
Yes.
But, tell us more.
Yeah, so I just really wanted to encourage people to explore Céline Sciamma's work as a filmmaker. So if you haven't watched anything other than Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I encourage you to watch her other works like Water Lilies and Girlhood. But there are two in particular I wanted to talk about. One is Tomboy from 2011. And that film stars Zoe Iran as a 10-year-old child who goes by the name Lore, is the title Tomboy, but Laura's family has moved to a new neighborhood and Laura's meeting some of the neighborhood children, and Laura's now presenting themselves as Michael. In this film, Laura's like grappling with their gender identity, having this ability to present differently as Michael as a way to start making sense of identity. There's like the social pressure of family, peer pressure at school, but also being found out by the kids. A rather sensitive topic, but I think that Sciamma does it really well in this film. So I highly recommend Tomboy. And then another Céline Sciamma film I want folks to watch is Petit Maman from 2021. And actually, as you said, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire for you was like the beginning of the pandemic. For me, this was like the beginning of the return to film festivals, because the first film festival I returned to was TIFF in 2021, and Petite Maman was one of the films I saw there. And there is a spoiler in the name, Petite Maman, or Little Mother. So this is a fable about a young girl whose family is dealing with the death of her grandmother, and the young girl Nellie plays outside in the woods outside of the mother's childhood home, and she meets this girl named Marion, and we soon learn that Marion is actually the same name as Nellie's mother, and the girl is actually her mother. It's like the spirit of her mother's childhood self. And it captures what's kind of special about childhood and what we lose when we grow up, and how we sort of have these different identities and different stages of our lives, like how the child version of us is different from the adult version. And you can see then the comparison with the two Marians, the young and the older one. It's a beautiful film. I highly recommend it. So whenever anybody asks for recommendations for lesbian films, I always recommend Portrait of a Lady on Fire and another film that I wanted to talk about, and that is the Kenyan film Rafiki from 2018. It's directed by filmmaker Wanuri Kahiu, and it's about these two young women in Nairobi, Kenna and Ziki, and they're the daughters of two political rivals, and they meet and they fall in love. There's this interesting Romeo and Juliet like quality about Rafiki, because not only are they from like two feuding families, there's also this constant threat of them being found out too, like in Romeo and Juliet. And in the case of Rafiki, it's the criminalization of homosexuality in Kenya, which puts them at risk. Now, this could have been a depressing film, but it really isn't. In fact, when I first reviewed it for my site Kel Movies, I called it equal parts heartbreaking and hopeful, because it's this like lovely mix of sweetness and hopefulness, this beautiful courtship, but then also this lingering danger in the background. For representation of lesbians on film, if you want an antidote to something like Blue is the Warmest Color, which I really like that film, but it is very much performative in how it shows the lesbian love story, in that Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Rafiki are a great antidote, I think, to that. And also a reminder, any films we talked about in this episode are on a dedicated Letterboxd list. So you can go to letterboxd.com/CineHistorians and you'll see the list for all of our episodes.
I think there's some great recommendations, and you're right to say that Petite Maman, now that I think about it, I also associate that film with the sort of, not end of the pandemic, but the sort of the reopening of society. Right. So I remember taking a group, a film discussion group, to see that film, and everybody, from what I remember, really loved it. And it's so slight but so powerful. It's a fantastic film.
Céline Sciamma was carrying us through the pandemic, it seems.
Very much so. You mentioned blue is the warmest color. I like that film too, but I think when we were talking earlier about the sort of voyeuristic approach, that's almost like Exhibit A, right?
Yes.
It's so it's worth flagging up the alternatives to it for sure. I wanted to talk briefly about a French painter called Hélène Delmaire. Very interesting woman. Basically, the hands that we see making sketches and portraits of Heloise in the film are not Noémie Merlant's, but they're the hands of Hélène Delmaire. Now, she's a woman who'd studied painting in Florence. I saw an interview with her where she talked about how she was taught to draw with crayons and then charcoal and then paint. She kind of was going against, she wanted to learn to paint in a more realist style, which she said wasn't in vogue as much anymore. She had painted some portraits where the eyes of the subjects were painted out, and she wonders if Céline Sciamma had saw these on Instagram, and that's the reason why she was drawn to her in terms of hiring her for this film. The way it worked during the making of the movie was that during filming, Delmaire was working on the paintings for the film in her apartment, which was close to where films were being shot. So she's having to work quite hurriedly sometimes on paintings for scenes that are going to be showcased on screen or in the scene a couple of days later. She would also get the call kind of late in the day during shooting after the actresses had finished filming their scene. Delmaire would get a call, come and be filmed painting and drawing. And she talked about how this was actually quite a strange experience because she felt like she was kind of surrounded on all sides because there are people around her like the boom operator and the cinematographer. And she said it wasn't easy. She had to think about painting at an angle because they had to account for things like the reflection of the spotlight. So, something that she can do very naturally, but actually in this context becomes a difficult thing. Painting sessions lasted for close to half an hour, the filmed painting sessions. And people told her that it made for quite a soothing end to the day for the crew because, people were tired after a long day at work and would end up just getting quite absorbed with the slow process of working away. So I quite like that description. Because she was on set doing these paintings during filming, it gave Noémie Merlant the opportunity to observe her and study her gestures. And she had done that before filming as well, to be clear. But she talked about how the gaze of an artist is really particular and that she wanted to try and form a full vision of what the painter does. And Delmaire said something similar, but actually it's characteristic if you're painting somebody, you look at them in a different way compared to the way you look at somebody in a more normal interaction. I just think it's a really interesting choice to have a real painter actually creating these paintings during the making of the film in question, because kind of tying back to what we were speaking about earlier, that if part of the impetus for the film is Céline Sciamma wants to counterbalance the fact that these women artists are being kind of erased from history or they'd already been erased and forgotten, it seems to me like by doing this, she's actually putting her money where her mouth is, right? Because the story of the film is about this artist, Marianne. And then outside the story of the film, it's also kind of documenting the work of this woman, Hélène Delmaire, because it captures her at work, like I say, in the ways we just talked about. So it's unlike those 18th century painters who had kind of been erased or forgotten about, because thanks to Céline Sciamma's film, Hélène Delmaire's creations and her creative process are now kind of captured for posterity. I don't know. It's very interesting, Raquel, isn't it? I don't know if you find it interesting, but I do.
I think that's another element of the filmmaking process being part of the film is the fact that she hired a painter, employed her for this, and there's these observations of Noémie Merlant trying to capture that, but then we see the real artist at work, we see the real hands at work, and this is real work too. Yeah, I think that just adds another element of authenticity.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier about how many layers there are in the film, and here is yet another one. All right, so I think we've kind of reached the part of the episode where we very sadly start to say goodbye, haven't we, Raquel? And we're very nearly at the point of saying goodbye to season 2, but not quite yet, because although we've talked about all of Raquel's 4 picks, there's still one of mine to come. Quite a different film to this one, I think.
Yes.
Raquel, do you want to tell people what we're talking about next time out?
Yes, we're talking about Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas from 1990.
Fantastic. Okay, and yeah, like I say, this is one of my picks. All right, I can't wait for that. It'll be good. And as we always say, Raquel, we always would like to encourage our listeners and our viewers to help us out. I mean, if you've made it this far, I think we can also ask that it'd be really, really appreciated if you left us a 5-star rating and review. If you're listening to us on platforms like Apple or Spotify or any other audio-only platform, that would be fantastic. There's a real purpose to that. It's not just to boost our ego. It's also because that kind of would help push us up the algorithm and help us find other film fans, who might like this podcast. And on YouTube, Raquel, it's it's smashing that button, isn't it? Turning on the reminders for new episodes and things like that, right?
Yeah, so I suggest lighting that subscribe button on fire. Subscribe to us and hit that bell notification so you never miss an episode.
Fantastic. Yeah, portrait of a subscribe button on fire. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of CineHistorians. Had a great time discussing this film, Raquel. Thanks ever to you as well. We'll be back very soon. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye now.
Bye.
You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.